The Varaxian guard's mandibles clicked in amusement as he shoved Sarah Chen into her cell. Another human refugee, he chittered to his companion. They're getting more desperate by the cycle. The metal door slammed shut with a resounding clang, leaving Sarah alone in the dim purple light of the prison ship's containment block. She remained still, knowing the guards were still watching through the observation panels. Her plain gray jumpsuit and slight frame made her look unremarkable, exactly as intended. The Varaxians, like most species in the galaxy, saw humans as primitive newcomers to interstellar society. They had no way of knowing they'd just imprisoned one of the last Earth peacekeepers. Sarah closed her eyes, extending her awareness beyond the cell's physical boundaries. The prison ship hummed with more than just engines and life support. It pulsed with the psychic energies of hundreds of captive beings. Some signatures were familiar, the crystalline thoughts of Meridian scholars, the deep rhythmic patterns of Jovian gas dwellers. But others felt wrong, distorted and twisted, as if their natural frequencies had been forcibly altered. Subject 2187 secure, a voice noted from outside. Proceed with processing of Block 7. Sarah kept her breathing steady as footsteps echoed down the corridor. 20 years of diplomatic service had taught her patience. The Varaxians were methodical, moving new prisoners through their system in carefully planned stages. It would give her time to work. She pressed her palm against the cell wall, feeling the vibrations of nearby minds. In the cell to her left, something ancient and powerful dwelled in complete darkness. To her right, multiple consciousness patterns overlapped and merged. Collective beings, perhaps, or a hive mind species. The Varaxians were gathering an impressive collection of the galaxy's most unique beings. The question was, why? A scream pierced the relative quiet, raw and primal, filled with more than just physical pain. Sarah's jaw clenched. The sound carried psychic overtones that made her temples throb. Someone was being torn apart, not just in body, but in the deeper layers of consciousness that most species couldn't even perceive. That's enough for today, a clinical voice announced. The subject's neural patterns are destabilizing. We'll resume after recalibration. Sarah forced herself to remain seated as rage built inside her. The peacekeepers had been founded to prevent exactly this kind of atrocity. For millennia, they had served as mediators and protectors, using their unique abilities to maintain balance between spacefaring civilizations. Now, with Earth quarantined behind an alien blockade, and most of her fellow peacekeepers dead or missing, Sarah might be the last one left. The lights dimmed, signaling night cycle. Sarah waited until the guard patrols passed twice before beginning her work. She sat cross-legged on the floor, dropping the mental barrier she normally kept raised. Her consciousness expanded outward like ripples in still water, touching the minds around her with the delicate skill of decades of practice. The being in darkness stirred, its thoughts unfurling like massive wings. Who touches us? The question carried undertones of surprise and hope. A friend, Sarah responded on the same frequency. I am Sarah Chen of Earth. Earth. The word echoed with recognition. The peacekeepers. We remember. Yes. And you are Umbran, aren't you? A shadow weaver. We were. Grief colored the thought. The bright shells took our shadows, locked us in their burning lights. We fade. Sarah's heart raced. The Umbrans were legend even among peacekeepers, ancient beings who could fold space itself, traveling through dimensions humans could barely comprehend. If the Varaxians were experimenting on them. I can help, she projected. But I need to understand what they're doing here. Will you show me? Images flooded her mind. Sterile laboratories, machines that peeled consciousness into component frequencies, tanks filled with swirling darkness. The Varaxians were methodically studying each species' unique abilities, trying to isolate and replicate them. They sought power over the fundamental forces that made each race special. Sarah withdrew carefully, processing what she'd learned. The Varaxians weren't just jailers. They were trying to steal the genetic and psychic heritage of every advanced species they could capture. If they succeeded, they could reshape the galaxy in their image. She couldn't let that happen. But she also couldn't reveal her abilities too soon. The Varaxians would be expecting new prisoners to be traumatized, confused, and afraid. She would play that role. For now. When the next guard patrol passed, Sarah huddled in the corner of her cell, shivering convincingly. Inside, her mind was racing, analyzing options and forming plans. The Umbrans weren't the only powerful beings imprisoned here. With time and care, she could forge connections, build trust, and create something the Varaxians never expected: hope. They thought they were collecting specimens. Instead, they had gathered the seeds of their own destruction. Sarah smiled in the darkness as she began to weave the first threads of rebellion into the prison's psychic tapestry. The Varaxians were about to learn why peacekeepers were both respected and feared throughout known space. She just needed time and patience. Both were resources she had in abundance. The experiments began 2 days after Sarah's arrival. She watched through half-closed eyes as the Varaxians dragged a crystalline meridian past her cell, its usual rainbow facets dulled to a sickly gray. The being's psychic signature flickered like a dying star. They were systematically destroying everything that made the meridians unique. Subject 2184 shows promising degradation patterns. A Varaxian scientist noted, mandibles clicking as he recorded observations. The crystalline matrix is becoming more susceptible to reconfiguration. Sarah felt the meridian's agony ripple through the prison's psychic field. The other prisoners recoiled, their own trauma and fear spiking in response. But beneath the fear, she sensed something else: anger, building like magma beneath a dormant volcano. The next cell extraction came for the Hive Mind Collective, the Nexus, as they called themselves. Sarah had spent the past days carefully building a rapport with them through subtle psychic connections. As the guards approached, she sent them a quiet pulse of reassurance. Remember what we discussed. Appear weakened. Hide your strength. The Nexus beings were beautiful in their natural state, streams of living energy that could flow between multiple host bodies. The Varaxians had trapped them in containment suits, trying to force their consciousness into separate vessels. But what their captors didn't understand was that the Nexus couldn't truly be divided. They were already adapting, learning to extend their awareness through the prison's power conduits. Fascinating resilience, one of the scientists mused, studying readings from the Nexus chamber. Their neural patterns should have fractured by now. Increase the isolation protocols by 30%. Sarah used the commotion to extend her awareness toward the Umbran cell. The shadow beings had grown stronger since she'd begun helping them reconnect with their innate abilities. It was delicate work. She couldn't risk the Varaxians noticing the change, but the Umbrans needed their power to survive. The bright shells return. The Umbran communicated. They'd bring their burning questions, their cutting lights. Hold fast, Sarah projected. Let them think you're weakening. The shadows will return. She had discovered that the prison's power grid created unexpected dark spaces, microscopic gaps in the artificial lighting where shadows could still form. The Umbrans were learning to thread their consciousness through these spaces, gradually rebuilding their connection to the darkness between dimensions. A new prisoner arrived that evening, a quantum dancer from the Carina Nebula. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the species. Quantum dancers existed partially outside normal spacetime, their bodies constantly phasing between multiple probability states. The Varaxians had somehow forced this one into a single quantum state, trapping it in one reality. Subject 2190 secured, a guard reported, beginning baseline measurements for probability manipulation trials. Sarah waited until deep night cycle before reaching out to the quantum dancer. Its consciousness was chaotic, thoughts scattered across multiple potential timelines. Be still, she soothed. Focus on my signal. Who, what, when, where. The being's response fragmented across possibilities. All paths lead to pain-death transformation. Not all paths, Sarah corrected. I can help you find the threads that lead to freedom. She had been building a network, carefully connecting prisoners whose abilities could complement each other. The Umbrans could move through shadows, while the Nexus could transmit information through power systems. The Meridians, even weakened, could focus and amplify psychic energy. And now a quantum dancer who could potentially navigate between realities if they could restore its natural state. But the Varaxians were getting closer to their goals. Sarah intercepted fragments of their research data through the Nexus's power line connections. They were mapping the unique energy signatures of each species, trying to create a process to transfer abilities between hosts. Most attempts failed catastrophically, burning out the subjects' minds. But they were learning, refining their terrible science with each experiment. Sarah's chance to observe their labs came 3 days later, when they finally called for Subject 2187. 2 guards escorted her through sterile corridors to a chamber filled with humming equipment. A Varaxian scientist approached, compound eyes gleaming with interest. "Commence baseline scanning," he ordered. "Human subjects have shown minimal psychic potential in previous trials, but we maintain protocol." Sarah allowed herself a small smile as they secured her to the scanning platform. Humans didn't naturally broadcast their abilities the way other species did. The peacekeepers had evolved their talents in secret, learning to work with and enhance the natural energies of other races while appearing unremarkable themselves. The scans began, probing her neural patterns. Sarah carefully projected the expected readings: minimal psychic activity, standard human biological markers. All the while, she absorbed every detail of the lab's layout, the security systems, the experimental apparatus. The Nexus would be very interested in what she observed. Results consistent with species baseline, the scientist noted with mild disappointment. Return subject to containment for monitoring. Back in her cell, Sarah immediately began sharing what she'd learned through the growing network of connected minds. The prisoners were becoming something new, not just isolated captives, but parts of a larger whole. Hope and purpose were spreading through the psychic field, replacing fear and despair. The Varaxians had made a critical mistake. In gathering the galaxy's most unique beings, they had created the potential for something unprecedented. A collaboration of abilities and intelligences unlike anything that had come before. And at the center of it all was a human, a peacekeeper who understood how to bring harmony from chaos. Sarah felt the first tremors of change running through the prison ship's foundations. The Umbrans were nearly ready. The Nexus had mapped every power conduit. The Meridians were focusing their remaining strength. The quantum dancer was finding its path back to possibility. Soon, very soon, the Varaxians would learn the true cost of their ambitions. The first sign that something was wrong came during the night cycle. Power fluctuations rippled through the prison ship's systems, subtle enough to appear as normal variations, but Sarah knew better. The Nexus was testing their growing control over the electrical grid, probing for weaknesses. Engineering reports nominal interference patterns, a Varaxian technician announced during shift change. Likely radiation effects from the nearby nebula. Sarah suppressed a smile as she listened through the cell's ventilation system. The Varaxians' greatest weakness was their certainty, their unshakable belief that they had everything under control. They didn't notice how the shadows in the corridors grew slightly deeper each cycle, or how the quantum readings in certain sections of the ship became increasingly unstable. The experimental chambers had become sites of quiet resistance. When the scientists attempted to map the Meridian's crystalline thought patterns, they found the readings impossible to parse, because Sarah had taught the crystal beings to fragment their consciousness across multiple frequencies. When they tried to isolate individual Nexus entities, the energy beings simply flowed through the ship's circuits, appearing to be random power surges. But it was the Umbrans who worried their captors most. The shadow beings were meant to be their crowning achievement. Proof that even the most ethereal species could be contained and studied. Instead, subjects kept deteriorating in their cells, their energy signatures fading to almost nothing. The Varaxians didn't realize these beings weren't dying. They were learning to exist almost entirely in the spaces between light. Increase illumination in Block 7 by 40%, the head scientist ordered after another failed examination. We cannot risk losing more specimens. The order played perfectly into their plans. More power meant more circuits for the Nexus to exploit. Brighter lights created darker shadows, giving the Umbrans stronger anchor points for their dimensional manipulation. Even the quantum dancer was benefiting, using the energy surge to slowly rebuild its probability field. Sarah coordinated it all through the prison's growing psychic network, teaching each species to work in harmony with the others. The Meridians amplified and relayed her instructions, their crystalline minds acting as perfect prisms for her thoughts. The Nexus carried messages through power lines, while the Umbrans could shift vital information through shadow spaces that the Varaxians couldn't monitor. But maintaining the deception was taking its toll. Every time the guards took another prisoner for experiments, Sarah felt their pain echo through the network. She had to constantly balance the need to appear weak against the risk of letting the Varaxians actually succeed in their research. One breakthrough could give them the key to stealing and replicating abilities across species. The breaking point came during a routine scan of a newly arrived stellar weaver, beings who could manipulate stellar energy itself. The Varaxians had somehow captured one in a containment field, but they hadn't counted on its connection to the distant stars still being active. Beginning primary neural mapping, the scientist announced, activating the scanning array. Subject shows unusual resistance to standard containment protocols. Sarah felt the moment the stellar weaver reached out, its consciousness stretching across light years to touch its sun. Power readings throughout the ship spiked as stellar energy poured through the being's neural pathways. The Varaxians scrambled to contain it, but they had no reference for dealing with this kind of power. Now, Sarah broadcast through the network, while they're distracted. The Nexus surged through the ship's overloading circuits, temporarily seizing control of critical systems. Security feeds flickered as the Umbrans pulled shadows across surveillance devices. The quantum dancer, finally strong enough, began shifting local spacetime, creating pockets of probability uncertainty that made it impossible for the Varaxians to coordinate their responses. Emergency containment protocols activated, flooding the experimental chamber with suppression fields. But the fields passed harmlessly through the stellar weaver, its energy now merged with forces far beyond the Varaxians' ability to contain. Solar fire danced across its skin as it rose from the scanning platform. "Full lockdown," a commander shouted. "All subjects must remain isolated." But isolation was no longer possible. The network Sarah had built was too strong, too interconnected. Each species supported the others, covering weaknesses and amplifying strengths. The Meridians channeled the stellar weaver's energy throughout the prison block, while the Umbrans used their shadow paths to protect more vulnerable prisoners from the chaos. Sarah stood in her cell, finally dropping all pretense of being a simple human refugee. Her mind reached out to touch each connected consciousness, weaving their abilities together into something new and powerful. The Varaxians had wanted to understand what made each species special. They were about to learn in the most dramatic way possible. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated as reality itself began to warp under the combined efforts of dozens of unique beings working in perfect harmony. Sarah felt the familiar pulse of peacekeeping energy flow through her, amplifying and directing the abilities of others. This was what her order had been created for, not to control or contain, but to help different species reach their full potential together. Through the chaos, she heard a Varaxian commander asking the question they should have considered from the beginning. What have we done? They had gathered the galaxy's most extraordinary beings in one place. They had given them a common enemy and a reason to work together. And most importantly, they had handed them the perfect leader, a human peacekeeper who knew exactly how to turn their differences into strengths. The final phase of their liberation was about to begin. Alarms blared throughout the prison ship as systems failed in cascading waves. The Varaxians had built their facility to contain individual species. They never imagined having to counter the combined powers of them, all working in perfect synchronization. Security breach in Block 7. Voices shouted over the comms. Multiple containment failures, unable to isolate source. Sarah strode through her now open cell door, her steps sure and purposeful. Gone was any pretense of being the helpless prisoner. The air around her rippled with psychic energy as she coordinated the rebellion through the network she'd spent weeks building. The Umbrans moved first, flowing through the shadows between light panels like living darkness. They engulfed Varaxian guards in waves of absolute black, not harming them, but leaving them trapped in dimensional pockets, experiencing what it felt like to be caged and powerless. Above, the Stellar Weaver soared through the corridors, its body incandescent with starfire. The Meridian's crystalline forms refracted its energy, turning the entire prison block into a maze of searing light and impenetrable shadow. Varaxian troops found themselves unable to trust their own compound eyes, their visual sensors overloaded by the spectacular display. Fascinating, isn't it? Sarah called out to a group of retreating scientists. You wanted to understand what makes each species special. Now you're seeing it firsthand. The Nexus beings flowed through the ship's power grid like living electricity, seizing control of doors, life support, and gravity systems. Sections of the prison shifted between zero and double gravity as they worked to separate prisoners from their captors. Through it all, the quantum dancer wavered between realities, making it impossible for the Varaxians to predict where the next attack would come from. But Sarah wasn't interested in revenge. She moved through the chaos with purpose, heading for the ship's central research database. The Varaxians' experiments had been cruel, but their data could help her understand what had happened to Earth and her fellow peacekeepers. Stop her, a commander ordered. A squad of elite guards formed a barrier ahead, raising weapons designed to disrupt psychic abilities. Sarah smiled. I'm not alone, she reminded them. The corridor's shadows deepened as Umbrans rose from the floor. The Nexus surged through nearby panels, while crystalline meridian energy formed a shimmering barrier around her. The guards' weapons fired, but their beams scattered harmlessly through probability clouds generated by the quantum dancer. You still don't understand what you're dealing with, Sarah said as she walked past their useless weapons. Humans aren't powerful because of any special ability. We're powerful because we can bring out the best in others. She reached the database core, where the Nexus had already begun extracting information. The files confirmed her worst fears. The Varaxians' experiments were part of a larger plan. They had discovered that Earth's peacekeepers could naturally enhance other species' abilities, and they wanted to replicate that power for themselves. You can't succeed, she told the chief scientist, who stood watching in defeat as his life's work was dismantled. What we do isn't about biology or energy patterns. It's about trust, understanding, and choice. As if to prove her point, the rescued prisoners were already helping each other. The Stellar Weaver's energy kept the ship's life support functioning for species that needed it. Umbrans created safe passages through shadow space for those who couldn't fight. The Meridians used their crystalline minds to coordinate evacuation efforts. Incoming ships detected. The Nexus reported through the power systems. Varaxian reinforcements. Sarah nodded. She had expected this. Is everyone linked into the network? Affirmative responses flowed back through multiple channels: light, shadow, crystal, and quantum space. Every being on the ship had chosen to join their shared consciousness, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Then let's show them why diversity is strength, Sarah declared. The quantum dancer began shifting space-time around the entire ship, making them partially out of phase with normal reality. The Stellar Weaver poured energy into the shields, while Umbrans wrapped the hull in layers of protective darkness. The Meridians formed a vast crystalline array, focusing and amplifying their combined powers. At the center of it all stood Sarah, the last peacekeeper, doing what her order had always done best, helping different species work together in harmony. The approaching Varaxian fleet would find not a prison in chaos, but a unified force unlike anything they had ever encountered. You wanted to understand what makes humanity special. Sarah broadcast to every Varaxian channel. Watch carefully. This is what we do best. We bring people together, even those who think they have nothing in common. We turn enemies into allies. We find strength in differences. The ship's engines hummed to life under the Nexus' control. They had no need to run or hide. The former prisoners had become something new together. Not victims, not test subjects, but a family forged in shared hardship and triumph. Sarah felt the warm pulse of connection flowing through the network she had helped create. The Varaxians had imprisoned them all, hoping to steal their powers. Instead, they had given birth to a new kind of unity, one that would change the galaxy forever. The real awakening wasn't about powers or abilities. It was about understanding that true strength comes from bringing out the best in others. The Varaxian fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect attack formation. 50 warships armed with the latest containment technology. They expected to find a prison in chaos. Instead, they faced something unprecedented in galactic history. The prison ship hung in space, transformed by its inhabitants' combined powers. Its hull rippled with quantum fluctuations, wrapped in layers of living shadow and stellar fire. Through the ship's communications array, Sarah broadcast a simple message. You've forgotten why the peacekeepers existed in the first place. Let me remind you. Inside the ship, every being was connected through the psychic network. Their consciousness merged into a singular purpose. The Varaxian sensors couldn't get a clear reading. The quantum dancer's probability fields made the ship exist in multiple states simultaneously, while the Umbran's shadow work rendered portions completely invisible. Final warning. The Varaxian admiral announced, "Return all specimens to containment or face immediate destruction." Sarah's response echoed through every ship in the fleet. We're not specimens. We're people. And we're not alone anymore. The first shots from the Varaxian fleet dissipated harmlessly against shields energized by stellar power and crystalline focus. The Nexus beings had complete control of the ship's systems, allowing them to respond with impossible speed and precision. But Sarah hadn't orchestrated this rebellion just to fight. Look at what we've achieved together, she broadcast, allowing the fleet to see through the ship's sensors. Every being here has chosen to be part of something greater. We're not defeating you with superior firepower. We're showing you a better way. The Meridians projected images throughout the fleet, memories of their imprisonment, but also of their liberation. They showed how Sarah had taught them to work together, how each species' unique abilities complemented the others. The Stellar Weaver's light carried these visions directly to Varaxian minds, while the Umbran shadows made them impossible to ignore. Your experiments sought to understand what makes each species special, Sarah continued. But you missed the most important lesson. True power doesn't come from stealing abilities. It comes from helping others reach their full potential. Some of the Varaxian ships began powering down their weapons. The images had struck home, making them question everything they'd been told about humanity's role in the galaxy. The peacekeepers weren't just diplomats or warriors. They were catalysts for cooperation between species. We offer you a choice, Sarah declared. Continue this fight, which you cannot win, or join us in building something new. Earth may be blockaded, but its principles live on. Every being has value. Every difference is a strength waiting to be discovered. The Admiral's ship maintained its attack posture, but others in the fleet were actively retreating. Through the network, Sarah felt the surge of hope from her allies. They weren't just escaping. They were changing how the galaxy would view cooperation between species. Your protocols are clear, the Admiral warned his fleet. The specimens must be contained. Your own people are choosing a different path, Sarah responded. This is humanity's gift to the galaxy. We show others how to choose freedom, understanding, and unity over fear and control. The prison ship began to move, not away from the fleet, but through it. The quantum dancer's probability fields made them partially intangible, while the Umbrans wrapped them in protective darkness. They passed through the Admiral's flagship like a ghost, leaving behind crystalline data nodes containing the truth about the experiments. You tried to study what makes each species unique, Sarah's final message echoed. Remember instead what makes us stronger together. The peacekeepers understood this. It's why we were feared by empires, but loved by those who sought harmony. As they accelerated away from the fleet, Sarah felt the network pulse with shared triumph. The Nexus beings had downloaded the ship's entire database, giving them proof of the Varaxians' experiment. The Varaxians had wanted to understand what made humanity special. Instead, they had helped create living proof of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to bring out the best in others, to forge unity from diversity, and to turn strangers into allies. Sarah Chen, the last peacekeeper, had done more than free a prison ship. She had reignited hope in the galaxy, proving that Earth's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who chose to stand together, celebrate their differences, and face the future as one.